Hello and welcome to the second lesson in the Logical English series of English lessons. If you haven't already seen lesson 1, please head on back to the website logicalenglish.com and watch the first lesson, as it's full of extremely useful, extremely important terminology and concepts and ideas which are invaluable for this for understanding this coming lesson. Also, if you haven't done so already, please download a study guide for this lesson, as that's equally important. Now, today we're going to be looking at another area of grammar which, once again, is poorly understood by students, because I'm afraid it's also relatively poorly understood by many teachers as well. It's the subject of the conditionals. And we're going to be looking at the traditional system versus a relatively new way of understanding this grammatical area. And by doing so, we're going to be gaining an insight into how native speakers subconsciously think. We'll also be seeing some gems and little bits of grammatical treasure along the way, which you can apply to other areas of your English as well. Now, just like in lesson 1, we're going to start relatively simply, establishing some essential terminology first, and from that, don't you worry, things will be getting quite complicated quite quickly. So, let's start simply. Okay, so as I say, we're going to be starting things relatively simply. As I say, it may seem simple, but later on this is going to provide some extremely valuable insights into how English works. But if you have a look in your study guide, you'll see these questions in front of you, or these sentences and these questions. In the following sentences, how many clauses are there? And in each sentence, can you also underline the main clause in each case? Now, by a clause, I mean, let's start with the definition that a clause is a chunk of a sentence, one complete idea in a sentence. So, I'll give you some time to think about that one just for a moment. So hopefully you've had enough time to complete the answers in your study guide. Let's start having a look at these sentences. The first sentence, my name is Carl. How many clauses are there? Well, hopefully you're able to agree with me that there is just the one clause in that sentence. And in that sentence, what is the main clause? Well, if there is only one clause, it is the main clause. It features the subject, my name, the verb is, and the object, Carl. My name is Carl. It's one clause, and it is the main clause. So there, let's continue to the end. There is the main clause, and it's one clause. In the second sentence, before I go home, I want to buy some milk. How many clauses are there? We have two clauses. Which one's the main clause, do you think? Which one contains the subject, verb, and an object? Which one, if you removed it, would mean that the sentence wouldn't make any sense? Well, I hope you agree with me that I want to buy some milk is the main clause. I is the subject. Want is the verb, and to buy some milk, we've got an infinitive-based object there. So what's before I go home? Well, clearly we've got a time clause at the front. So we've got a time clause followed by a main clause. In sentence C, I need to speak to my boss after I finish writing this letter. How many clauses do we have? Once again, we have two clauses. And this time we've got the two clauses reversed. The main clause is I need to speak to my boss, with the time clause after I finish writing this letter. In the fourth sentence, If you need some help, all you need to do is ask me. Number of sentences? Number of clauses? 2 clauses. Any ideas about the main clause? Yep, all you need to do is ask me. It's a slightly strange main clause, but we've got the subject, all you need to do, then the verb is, and ask me as the object. So what's this bit over here? If you need some help. That's what we call the conditional clause. So we've got the main clause on one side and the conditional clause on the other side. And the final sentence here, I will go out after work if I finish my assignment. How many clauses do we have? Once again, we've got 2 clauses. We have the main clause, I will go out after work, and we've got the conditional clause, if I finish my assignment. So let's have a quick summary of what we've just seen and start to build a deeper insight into the language. In a simple conditional sentence, how many clauses are there? Well, I hope you agree with me that, as we've just seen, there are normally 2 clauses. And indeed, does it matter which way round these clauses are placed? Not at all. Hopefully you agree with me there. And let's have a look at an example of that. So for example, if it rains, I will buy an umbrella. We've got the conditional clause first, then the main clause. We could also put the main clause first. I will buy an umbrella if it rains. But what do you notice about the difference? There's a small difference between those 2 sentences. This difference gives us a rule that you must apply to your sentences. And the rule is this. If the conditional clause comes before the main clause, you need to place a comma between them. And if you're not quite sure what a comma is one of these things. You know, there's another one here. There's one up here. So those are commas. If the conditional clause comes before the main clause, you need to place a comma between them. However, if the main clause comes before the conditional clause, no comma. You might think to yourself, well, this is just a crazy rule, who cares? But, well, let me give you a word of advice here. Examiners look at this very closely. When they're examining when they're marking your writing and they see a conditional clause followed by a main clause, if you've forgotten to put the comma there, they let out a little evil laugh and put a red line through your sentence. So don't give them that satisfaction. Now, before we continue with some of the deeper insights into English and the conditionals that I want to go through with you, I want to briefly examine first what we understand as the traditional or the traditionally taught system of conditionals in English. And if you're watching this lecture, it is highly likely that you're pretty familiar with the traditional system. First of all, quick question: how many conditionals are there in English? Hopefully, you've been taught at some point that there are 4 conditionals, and they are 0, first, second, and third. I suppose you could also argue that there's mixed as well, a possible 5th conditional, but we'll stick with these 0, first, second, and third conditionals. Let's get an example of each one. 0 conditional: if you heat water to 100 degrees C, it boils. First conditional: if it rains, I will buy an umbrella. Second conditional: if I liked to cook, I would cook. Third conditional: if I had seen you there, I would have said hello. And you would probably have also seen the diagram of how we create those different conditionals in English. We've got 0, if plus present simple, comma, present simple. First would be if plus present simple, comma, future simple. Second comes across as if plus past simple, comma, would plus present simple. Third would be if plus past perfect, comma, would plus present perfect. I'm sure you've all seen that kind of thing before. And you probably learnt many of the conditionals just based on that, and had a hard time putting all of that, putting that into your brain. And so 0 is always true. First is a possible future based on some kind of evidence. Second is extremely unlikely. You might want to say impossible, but I suppose you could also argue that, you know, quantum physics states that it might be possible, so we'll say 0.0000001% chance. Third conditional's like a time machine, imagining a different past, going back in time and changing the past. So which two of these are real and which two of these are unreal? Well, the 0 and first we'll call real conditionals, and the second and third we tend to call them unreal conditionals. So there we go. That is the traditional system that you've probably been taught about how to understand the conditionals. But there's the problem. I don't think it does give any real understanding. It's just something you remember parrot fashion and try to use. Not only that, but it's now going to be my endeavour to try and prove to you that it's not only complicated, but completely wrong as well. Well, not completely wrong, but it certainly causes problems when students get to a higher level, when they see that there are sentences which completely disagree with this. And I want now to give you an example of that. Indeed, I'd been teaching conditionals using this traditional method for years, until one particularly intelligent student came up to me with a bit of confusion and a sentence in his hand, and asked me to try and explain it. And I'll show you that sentence now. The sentence was this: when I was a kid, if I was good, my mum would let me watch TV. It's a perfectly good sentence, nothing wrong with that. Until you start to investigate it and try and pin it to the traditional system. I want you to answer these couple of questions. First of all, what conditional does this look like? And secondly, is it a real or an unreal conditional sentence? Okay, so what have we got? We've got when I was a kid, if I was good. If I was good, so we've got past simple there. Past simple. So if I was, so the conditional clause is past simple. My mum would let me, and then we've got the main clause, my mum would. So we've got would plus would let me watch TV. So that's present simple. Okay, so we've got past simple, comma, would plus present simple. So it looks like, if we just re-explore our traditional system, let me just get rid of that, if plus past, there we go, if second conditional, if plus past simple, would plus present simple. Okay, so we know what's happening there. Let's go back to it. So it looks like second conditional, and is it real or is it unreal? Well, I tell you, I mean, this is genuinely me. This is about me and my life. When I was a kid, if I was good, my mum would. She would let me watch TV. Yeah, if I was good, and often I was good. So is it real or is it unreal? Well, it's genuinely about my life. So it's, hold on, it's a real condition. It's a second conditional, but it's a real conditional. Let's go back to our traditional system. It's a second conditional, but it's real. Now, what I want to encourage you to think is, imagine one day we have the theory of gravity. If you drop a ball and suddenly one day it flies up into the air instead of falling to your feet, you can't just say, well, don't worry about that, we'll make an exception. No, you have to go back to the drawing board and think, okay, there's something wrong with our theory of gravity. Let's start afresh. Let's really try and understand what's actually happening here, as opposed to just creating an exception. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. What I want to encourage you to do is to take this idea of the traditional system and just put a big red line all the way through it. It's not, as you continue to have a look at, having a look at more complicated or more advanced grammatical ideas within English, this is just not going to help you at all, and it's going to be my job now to try and teach you something that will help you in so many areas, not the least of which being the conditional systems itself. So let's continue and have a look at the newer system, I suppose. Okay, as we move on, I wanted to just take this opportunity to remind you that if you haven't already seen Lesson 1 in the Logical English series of lessons, please stop what you're doing, head back to the website, logicalenglish.com, and watch that video now, because we're going to be using some of the ideas from that video, and we're going to be bringing them into what we're learning and developing about the conditionals and other grammatical structures right now. So if you haven't done so already, please head back and watch that video. If you have watched that video, quick question for you. Do you remember how many tenses there are in English? Well, hopefully you do, and hopefully you can also remember what they are. Let's have a look at them. We've got past, present, and future, and simple, continuous, perfect, and perfect. Continuous. And hopefully you remember that all we really do is, well, we've got 4 past, so past simple, past continuous, past perfect continuous. We've got present simple, present continuous, present perfect continuous, and we've got future simple, future continuous, future perfect continuous. 12 tenses, nice and logically laid out, and there you are. And if you don't recall, let's just remind ourselves, if I say continuous, you're going to say the auxiliary verb. Which one? It's the auxiliary verb to be. If I say perfect, you say the auxiliary verb have. If I say perfect continuous, you say, well, you can then say have and be. If we say simple, well, we're just going to just use a conjugated main verb. And if we remind ourselves of the 3 golden rules as well, you can logically create the tenses from what we see here. So we have the 12 tenses in English. But now here's a slightly stranger question, which I pretty much guarantee you haven't yet been asked. We've got 12 tenses, but how many times are there in English? How many different times can we refer to grammatically? Just have a think about that one for a moment. Okay, hopefully you've had a brief chance to think about that question I just asked you. So how many times do you think there are in English? Well, yeah, it's a tricky question. And it's certainly not one that we're normally encouraged to think about. We're thinking about English in a slightly different way here. So if I tell you there are 4 times that we can refer to in English, and I'll show you what they are. We've got the future over here. We've got the present. Before the present, we've got past number 1. And before past number 1, we've got past number 2. So which of our tenses do you think go into these different categories? I'll give you a bit of a clue. The future uses 4 tenses. The present uses 2. The past number 1 uses 4. And past number 2 uses 2. Have a think about that. See how you're going to divide them up. And hopefully, if you've had a chance to think about that, you'll well, I'll give you the answers here. We've got the 4 future tenses, which are simple enough: future simple, future continuous, future perfect, and future perfect continuous. We've got the 2 present tenses, present simple and present continuous. Strange, isn't it? English only uses 2 tenses to discuss the present, really. We've got 4 past number 1 tenses: past simple, past continuous, present perfect, and present perfect continuous. But I encourage you to remember that the only reason we call those present perfect, for example, is because we're using the auxiliary verb have in the present form. But if we're using the auxiliary verb have, we're still throwing things into the past. So present perfect is actually talking about the past. And past number 2, we've got 2 tenses here: past perfect, it's sometimes called the past of the past, and past perfect continuous. So there we have the 12 different tenses laid out in the 4 different times that we can refer to in English. And in fact, I'm going to simplify this diagram a little bit, or at least abbreviate it here. We've got P number 2, P number 1, PR, F. So we've got past number 2, past number 1, present and future. And you can see that I've abbreviated them a little bit later. That's going to save a lot of time and save a lot of space. Okay, now I want us to start thinking about the conditionals. And as I said previously, throw that 0, first, second, third mixed stuff, throw that in the bin. You don't need that anymore. However, I do want to keep the idea of real and unreal conditionals. And we're going to look first at the idea of real conditionals. It's and I want to encourage you to think that it's really I don't even think they're really conditionals. I think they're just standard English. Let's start having a look at what I mean. So we've got this example here. If you heat water to 100 degrees C, it boils. And before anyone starts nitpicking this, let's say that this is at sea level, at 1 atmosphere, standard conditions, right? If you heat water to 100 degrees C, it boils. So the question for you, in this sentence, is there any difference between the condition we've created and reality, or the truth? Are we imagining a crazy world? Are we imagining an impossible world here? Well, fundamentally, no. If you heat water to 100 degrees, it always boils, right? This is normal life. We are not changing reality in the slightest here. Let's take a look at another example of a real conditional. And here it is. We've seen it before. If it rains, I will buy an umbrella. And I ask you the same question. In this sentence, is there any difference between the condition we've created and reality, or the truth? Are we imagining a crazy world that could never happen? Or is actually, is this possible? And I hope you're understanding now that I'm making a prediction of what really might happen, right? The chances of it raining are above 0.000000001%. So this is, the idea of rain is a real possibility. And so in this sentence, because we're talking about the future, in the main clause, I'm going to use a future tense. I'm not doing anything interesting with it. I'm talking about the future, so I use the future. In both of these real so-called conditionals, I'm doing nothing interesting with any of the tenses in any part. It's just absolutely standard English. At this point, I just want to jump back to something that I'm sure you guys already know. It's incredibly simple, but it's going to play an important part a little bit later, and it's a good time to mention this. We're just going to go back to this sentence here. If you heat water to 100 degrees C, it boils. We've already seen that sentence. But here's a new question for you. In this sentence, which word can we replace if with? And I'm sure the answer's leaping out at you already. You already know that we can replace the word if with the word when. And what happens in this case? If we replace if with when, with real conditionals, you can always replace if with when, and it will make the speaker seem sure of the condition. Now that's an important point. It won't necessarily make the condition more real or more likely. It will just simply make the speaker seem that they think it's more likely or more real. If we take the sentence, if it rains, I will buy an umbrella. Well, if we change if to when it rains, I will buy an umbrella, suddenly the speaker thinks that it's definitely going to rain. Just like in this sentence, when you heat water to 100 degrees C, it boils. It's definitely going to happen. So we can replace if with when to make the speaker seem more sure of the condition. Keep that fact in your brain somewhere, and we'll return to that a little bit later. We're going to turn our attention now to something that I think is far more grammatically interesting, and that's the idea of unreal conditionals. This is where, yeah, as I said, things start to get a little bit strange. But we're going to endeavour to understand the logic and the patterns behind what's happening here. Let's take a look at an example. Let's imagine it like this. Let's imagine the truth. The truth: I do not like classical music, so I do not listen to it. With the conditional, if I liked classical music, I would listen to it. However, I do not like classical music, so I do not listen to it. Let's start to look at the tenses involved here. We'll do this together. So I do not like classical music. So in this truth statement, we've got, what tense is that? We've got present simple. It's a statement of fact. I do not like classical music, present simple. So I do not listen to it. Once again, we've got present simple. So I'll give you the answers here for the conditional. If I liked classical music, I would listen to it. What tenses do we have involved here? Well, if I liked classical music, we've now got past simple. And then we've got would plus, well, let's alter things a little bit. It's not even would plus present. It's just would plus a base form. It's rule number 1 that we saw in the previous lesson. Would plus a base form, and we're not using have to throw things into the past. It's just we're talking about now and always. So would plus the base form of the verb of the infinitive to listen, which is just listen. I would listen to it. So if I liked classical music, I would listen to it past simple plus would plus and then comma would plus base form. Do you see what's happened with the tense there? We're going to examine that in just a moment, but at this point, I want to give you another thing to remember, and that's this. Always remember, as shown above, in an unreal conditional, you must place if on one side of the sentence and would on the other side. Never place if and would on the same side. This is in fact a mistake made by many native speakers, and we'll come to address that, the whys behind, the reasons behind that mistake a little bit later. But if on one side, would on the other. But let's return to our times diagram to see what actually happened there. So here we are back at our times diagram, and we've got that simplified form of it again, plus another feature which I'll explain a little bit later. Let's just remember our sentence from a little bit earlier. I do not like classical music, so I do not listen to it. Well, I do not like classical music. What tense is that? I do not like. Well, that's present simple, right? With the condition that we created, if I liked classical music, we decided that was past simple. So we've got the truth in present simple, and we created the condition in past simple. So we jumped back one tense. Let's take a look at another example. We've got the truth. I did not see you, so I did not say hello. Well, what tenses do we have there? I did not see you. We've got past simple, right? I did not see you, so I did not say hello. We've got, again, we're dealing with the past simple. If we create the conditional from this, if I had seen you, what tense is that? We've got past perfect. And then on the other side, well, the traditional system would say that we've got would plus present perfect, but it's nothing of the sort. It's not really present perfect. We've got would, absolutely. But then, because we want to talk about the past, because in the truth it's about the past, right? We want to talk about the past. This would just tells us, in this mode anyway, that we're creating an unreal conditional. So we need a word next that will throw things into the past. We know from rule number 1 that we need to use a base form. So I can't say would said, because rule number 1, I need a base form. So I'm going to use an auxiliary verb, have, to throw things into the past. And, well, it's going to be the base form of have because of this word would, rule number 1. So would have. And now, well, now I've got the auxiliary verb have. So rule number 2, the next verb, which in this case is our main verb, has to be a past participle. So would have said. It's not really present perfect, it's just would plus the 3 golden rules. In this case, the first 2 of them. So here's the interesting thing then when it comes to this process. I did not see you, that's the truth. The condition, if I had seen you, we're going from past simple to past perfect. Again, we've jumped back. And in fact, if we complete this diagram a little bit more, if the truth is in present continuous, so for example, I am recording this lesson, we actually jump back to past continuous. If I was not recording this lesson, I would be sitting on the beach, for example. If the truth is in past continuous, so for example, I'm talking about yesterday. Yesterday, I was sitting on the beach. Well, from that, we jump back to past perfect continuous. If I had not been sitting on the beach, I would have been visiting friends, for example. If the truth is in present perfect, so I have been to New York, it jumps back again to past perfect. So if I had not been to New York. If the truth is present perfect continuous, it jumps back to past perfect continuous. So I have been walking. If I had not been walking, I would have been sitting, for example. A couple of points to remember here. The first of which is going to come in useful in later lessons, but for now it's just for the purposes of completing this diagram. Would, as a modal verb, can be the backshift of will, and could, again as a modal verb, can sometimes be, well, in certain situations, can be the backshift of can. What do we call this process? Well, I've just given you a bit of an indication. We call this backshifting. And it is an amazingly important concept to get to grips with in English. Not just for conditionals, but for other grammatical areas, which we're going to see a little bit later. There's something you might have noticed about this diagram, and that's the fact that nothing seems to be happening here. In fact, for reasons I'm going to come to a little bit later, because we've got other things to discuss before that, believe me. For reasons I'm going to come to a bit later, there is no backshifting from future tenses to the present tense, or from the future time to the present time, let's say. So there is no backshift here, but this is, if you can get this diagram in your head, this is how English works. Now, in a little while, we'll be coming on to having a look at some examples together, some examples of unreal conditionals, and we'll be taking the concepts we've just learnt about backshifting and exploring this idea in other grammatical areas of English as well. But before we do that, I just want to return and have a quick revision of our 3 golden rules that we saw in lesson number 1. The 3 golden rules. What was? Can you remember what number 1 was? Or what number 1 is? After a modal verb, we always use a, what do we use after a modal verb? We use a base form. What about number 2? After the auxiliary verb have, once again, we always use a past participle. Number 3, after the auxiliary verb be, we not always, but normally use a present participle. And once again, why is it normally? Well, it's normally a present participle because we can also follow the auxiliary verb to be with a past participle. That's what this B3 symbol is all about down here, and that creates what kind of structure? That creates a passive voice. So that's why I say normally there. If you want some further revision of those rules, head on back to lesson 1 and watch that again and then rejoin us. Okay, so with the backshifting diagram fresh in our minds and the 3 golden rules on the tip of our tongues, let's go and have a look at some examples, shall we? And these examples are in your study guide. If you haven't got a study guide, please head onto the website and download one. Let's have a look at these examples together. I'm going to give you a moment to have a look through them and to complete your answers, and we'll check them out in just a moment. Now, just in case, I'm going to give a quick couple of hints here. If I say that A, B, C all represent unreal conditionals, and D and E are both real, I'll give you a moment longer. So let's have a look. The truth: I can't swim, so I don't swim in the sea. Well, can't, having a look at your diagram, can't or can backshifts to, that's right, if I could. And now we've got modal verbs, so the next verb has to be a base form, and it's our main verb. If I could swim, so we've got if on one side. What do we have on the other in an unreal condition? We've got would on the other side. I would swim in the sea. Notice, hopefully your language is working exactly the same way, but I know some of them don't. Up here, we've got a negative on one side and a negative on the other side. We're going to make them both positive. Because we're imagining a different world in an unreal conditional. The second one, I do not like to cook, so I eat out a lot. However, if I, now what tense is this? Do not like. So it's negative, present, simple. So we'll just make it positive, past simple. That's what it backshifts to. If I liked, you could also say did like, but we'll keep things simple. If I liked to cook, and again it's an unreal conditional, so we're going to have if on one side and would on the other side. Now, would here is followed by not, and I know you're saying that's not a base form, but don't forget the rule is it's the next verb is going to be the base form. So not is just an adverb making this negative, and then we've got eat, would not eat out a lot. C, the truth: I did not go shopping, therefore I have no food now. However, now what tense is did not go? That's past simple. What does past simple backshift to? That's right, past perfect. Let's make the negative positive. If I had, and then rule number 2, gone shopping. And now this is what the traditional system would call a mixed conditional, but I just completely disagree. I would. Now this is a bit confusing. This have makes it look like it could be thrown into the past, but this is actually our main verb in the main clause. So it's a base form of the main verb, possession. I would have food now. And so we're talking about a present outcome. And so we're not using the auxiliary verb have to throw things into the past. Just the main verb following the modal verb would. Now we've got a couple of real conditionals, or supposed conditionals. I'll probably see her tonight, so I'll say hello to her from you. Now this is a real situation. I think, there's a good chance I might see her tonight. So, quite simply, if I see her tonight, we don't have to do anything crazy with the tense there. And, well, hey, we're talking about the future, so let's stick with the future. We don't need to use would or anything like that. We're just going to keep it the same, basically. I will say, and I know you're thinking, but that's the same as the truth sentence. Yes, it is exactly the same. Nothing's really changing. The final one, the truth: I always buy coffee when I visit my favorite cafe. So we've got what, a time clause and the main clause. Well, it's absolutely identical. Sorry, a bit of a trick by me. I always buy a coffee if I visit my favorite cafe. All we've done is changed when to if, and the sentence means exactly the same thing. I hope you're picking up the clue here that when I visit my favourite cafe, a time clause, and if I visit my favourite cafe, a conditional clause, they're looking remarkably similar right now, huh? Yes, we'll refer to that in just a moment after we have a look at an interesting thing to remember in all of this conditional stuff. Oh, just quickly before we move on, something I'll quickly check with you guys. I'm sure you already know it, but it's worth just going over quickly for the purpose of comprehensiveness, for the purpose of making sure we include all the relevant information. And it's this idea of was or were. When you backshift the verb to be to, well, do you say if I was you or do you say if I were you? Which one's correct? I'm sure you're already aware of it, but let's just have a quick check. We've got was versus were. The truth, I am not you, so blah, 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 blah. The condition, if I, well, here you can say, really, you can say if I was or were you. If I was you, if I were you, I'd blah, 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 blah. Another example, the truth, she is not going to the party, so blah, blah, blah. Condition, if she, and once again, was or were going to the party, I would blah, 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 blah. Now what you're seeing here is, even if you're using I or he, she, it, if you backshift the verb to be, you're always correct to use, to backshift the verb to be to were. This creates a more formal structure, more likely for writing. Whereas if you conjugate it like you would normally do, so if I was you, if he, if he was her, etc., etc., that creates a more informal, a more spoken form of conditionals. Let's just get that rule up. So the rule, when creating an unreal conditional, you're always correct to backshift be to were. Backshifting be to was is informal, whereas were is formal. So if you're writing some kind of, IELTS or Cambridge exam, if you're doing the writing there and you're backshifting the verb to be, make sure you're using were. Okay? Alright, let's move on. We're going to take a step into the mind of the native speaker here, and it might seem a little bit crazy to you, but I promise you this is really how we think. We might not be aware that this is how we think, but this is it. I want to give you a couple of example sentences. Sentence A, if I win the lottery, I will buy a house. Sentence B, if I won the lottery, I would buy a house. My question for you is this. Which person, A or B, is bad at maths? It's a strange question to follow up those two sentences, but hopefully I'll try and explain it now. Make your guesses first, though. Which person, A or B, has created an unreal conditional? Which one has backshifted the if clause and used the modal verb would on the other side? That's person B, right? Person B has created an unreal conditional. Person A hasn't backshifted anything and hasn't used the modal would on the other side. They're just referring to the future. They're just referring to the future in the simplest possible way. So person A has created a real conditional. So in the mind of person A, and this is the important thing, in the mind of person A, they will win the lottery, or they think they stand a very good chance. In the mind of person B knows and understands that, well, they're extremely unlikely to win the lottery, 0.000000001% chance or whatever, and so that's why they've created the unreal conditional here. Let me just bring this explanation up as well. Person A has created a real conditional, whereas person B has created an unreal conditional. Therefore, person B knows that they will almost certainly not win, while person A believes that their lottery ticket is probably the winner. So this is the important point, that it's how likely the person believes the condition to be, which would set up whether it's a real or unreal condition. It's not the actual mathematical statistical likelihood, but how real it seems in the person's mind. So which person, A or B, is bad at maths? Well, a native speaker would assume that actually person A is bad at maths, because while both sentences are absolutely correct, we would assume that you know what you're talking about and you're just not very good at mathematics. Whereas person B understands the truth of any lottery kind of situation. I want now to move on to this idea, to address this idea that future times don't seem to backshift to present times, because it seems a little bit strange at first. But let's remember a couple of things. Let's bring up a couple of examples here. I've written 3 sentences here. Well, if I see her at the party at 8 o'clock, I will say hello. In all of these sentences, the I will say hello is the main clause. Let's focus on the other clause for the moment. If I see her at the party at 8 o'clock, we know, as we've seen already, that it means exactly the same as when I see her at the party at 8 o'clock. The only difference being that when I see her at the party, now this person is very sure that they're going to see her at 8 o'clock. Now, if I see her at the party is a conditional clause, right? When I see her at the party is a time clause. And actually it means exactly the same as at 8 o'clock, which is when I'll see her, I will say hello. And that's definitely a time clause. And so this is what I really want to drum into you guys at the moment, is that time clauses and conditional clauses are exactly the same. Now, if conditional clauses and time clauses are exactly the same, something you can never do in English is to place a time clause in the future. It's something that you're expected to learn while learning English, but it very rarely actually gets explicitly taught. But time clauses, and therefore conditional clauses, can never be placed in the future. In French, for example, you can say some kind of translation of when I will see her, I will say hello, and both clauses would get a future tense. But in English, the time clause, and therefore the conditional clause, can never be placed into the future. It's simply when I see her, I will say hello. It's the main clause that gets the future treatment, and the time clause, and therefore the conditional clause, remains as a present if we're talking about the future. They can go into the past, just not into the future. And so follow this logic through. If a time clause, and therefore a conditional clause, can never be placed into the future, they can never backshift. They can never be in the future to backshift to the present. And that's why there is absolutely no backshift from the future to the present in English, and which is why you see a big red cross on this diagram. So don't forget, future tenses time clauses don't exist. The future cannot backshift into the present. The only backshifting we're talking about is what you see in the diagram. So there are a couple of exercises in the study guide for you to practice what we've just discussed, but specifically relating to the paragraph explaining the logic of backshifting and why things can't backshift from the future. I'll just go through it orally with you now. If conditional clauses are grammatically the same as time clauses, and we know that time clauses cannot be expressed using a future tense, then it follows that it is not possible to backshift a conditional clause in an unreal conditional from a future time into a present time, because it was impossible to express the original truth of the conditional using a future time. Using a future time to begin with. So that helps you to fill out the study guide. Now let's move on to the next point, which will deepen your understanding of not only conditionals, but the whole English language. Okay, we're going to come on now to what is the final point, the final issue in today's conditionals lesson, and it's not a critical point, but it is one that will allow you a little deeper understanding into how English works. But if you get it a little bit wrong, no one's going to crucify you. Let's first have a look at some things that we know to be true. We know that if a conditional clause is placed before a main clause, they're separated by a comma, right? We saw that right at the beginning. We know that a conditional clause is the same as a time clause. We've seen that. I've proven that to you. We also know that, well, and this is doubly true in my case, we want to make English as logical as possible. So, taking a look at this sentence, at 11 o'clock tonight I'll be fast asleep. If you were to read that in a book or a magazine, as you may well do, some kind of structure like that, it might not instantly be wrong. You might not, it might never get corrected. But knowing what you now know, what would you do to that sentence to make it 100% correct? Well, we've got at 11 o'clock tonight, that's a time clause. And we've got I'll be fast asleep, that's the main clause. A time clause is the same as a conditional clause, and hey, if a conditional clause is placed before a main clause, they're separated by a comma. So if a time clause is placed before a main clause, so let's also separate it by a comma. Here's a couple more examples for you. All through next week, I'm going to be incredibly busy. We've got the time clause, and I'm going to be incredibly busy. That's the main clause. So the time clause is coming before the main clause. Let's put a comma in there. I'm going to be a rich man in the year 2020. Well, now we've got things reversed. In the year 2020 is the time clause. We've got the main clause, I'm going to be a rich man, coming before the time clause. So actually we've no need to put a comma there, do we? And finally, I'll start cooking dinner just before she gets home from work. Well, we've got the main clause coming first, and just before she gets home from work is the time clause, but this person's put a comma there. Now, as I say, no one's going to mark that as massively wrong, but I think it's worth pointing out that it's just not necessary to put that comma there. So let's get rid of that because we've got the main clause first, followed by a time clause. No need for the comma there. So now it's time, finally, to return to that sentence that I showed you a lot earlier. The one that was brought up to me by that student. The one that started all my research and started all the digging. Let's remind ourselves of that sentence. I bet you thought I'd forgotten about it, huh? Here it is. When I was a kid, if I was good, my mum would let me watch TV. Well, earlier it confused us. Earlier it seemed like it was a second conditional, but it also seemed real, and we weren't quite sure what to do with it. Now applying what we now know to this sentence, let's have a look at it again. First of all, how many clauses are there? We've got 3 clauses. We've got this time clause, when I was a kid. We've got this conditional clause, if I was good. And we've got the main clause, my mum would let me watch TV. Well, now we know that time clauses are conditional clauses. Conditional clauses are time clauses. They are basically the same thing. So really, we're looking at two of the same thing here. If I was good, if we're saying it's a real conditional, let's make it a little bit more certain. Let's change if. We know that we can change if to when, right? When I was good. So when I was a kid, when I was good, or if I was good. Now, I'm talking about the past, right? I'm talking about past number one, and I'm using a tense in past number one. So there actually has been no backshift whatsoever. So I haven't instigated any kind of unreal situation. I'm talking about past number one. I'm using past number one. No backshift has happened at all. So that's our first indicator that this is just a standard real conditional. Moving on to the main sentence, this is again where things get a little bit tricky. My mum would let me watch TV. Now we've seen the word would again and again and again, and we know that modal verb is for unreal conditionals, right? But here I need you to remember what we learnt in lesson number one. Why are modal verbs called modal verbs? They're called modal verbs because they have at least two modes, at least two functions. They can do at least two things. And although, yes, the word would as a modal verb is normally used to create an unreal conditional, one of its other uses is to describe repeated habits in the past. In fact, will, if we take another example, will is normally used to describe the future, but it can also be used to describe repeated actions in the present. So they're very much the past and present of each other. So if we use this one, my mum would let me watch TV. Well, not always, but it was a repeated action in the past. She had this tendency that if I was good, she would normally let me watch TV. So although we've got the word would, we're not using it to create an unreal conditional. We're using it to create past habits, past tendencies. So we've got an unbackshifted conditional clause or time clause, if I was good, talking about past number one. And in the main clause, we're just using would for past tendencies. No unreality in there whatsoever. And so that, now we've passed that sentence a little bit, that explains what was happening there and why it was so confusing to us earlier. Okay, now you've got all of that conditional information in your minds. Let's just take this quick opportunity to have a brief summary of what we've looked at so far. Just like we did in lesson one, let's try and boil things down to their essence. So we're looking at a summary of the conditionals, and the first thing we're going to mention is if you're creating a real conditional, you don't need to do anything interesting with the grammar. Nothing backshifts. If you're talking about the future, use the future. If you're talking about the past, use the past. There's nothing interesting that happens there, even to the extent, as I said earlier, that I would argue that real conditionals are not even really conditionals. They're just time clauses with standard main clauses. The second thing, if you're creating an unreal conditional, you only need to backshift the conditional clause, not the main clause. Don't backshift both of them, just the conditional clause, just the if clause. Next one. In an unreal conditional, use would, possibly might or could, in the main clause. Never place if and would on the same side. Never place them on the same side. And finally, I've stressed this already, but I'm gonna continue to stress this because it's really how native speakers think, whether we're aware of it or not. Get that backshifting diagram into your head. Learn to dance around the tenses, because it's not only backshifting, but in order for us to interpret an unreal conditional, we then need to forward shift. So we're always dancing around these tenses. And so when we're talking about the past, or if we use past number one, we might not actually be talking about the past. I mean, that's a very strange thing to wrap your head around, but it's how native speakers work. And the more solidly you can get that backshifting diagram into your head and start dancing around the tenses, the better an English speaker you'll be. Okay, now when it comes to conditionals, we're pretty much finished there. We've seen how backshifting relates to conditionals, and we've seen how incredibly important it is. There's a couple more things I want to go through, and that's how backshifting relates to more advanced areas of English, and also I want to have a look at a couple of errors made by native speakers, and we can understand why some native speakers make them, and how to avoid them. So first of all, backshifting is incredibly important when it comes to understanding how to fully use English and how to start doing the dance of the tenses like native speakers do. We may not be aware that we're doing it, but we're certainly doing it all the time. Let's have a look at a couple of areas where backshifting is essential. First of all, wishes. Now, I won't go into this in too much detail, but wishes they're very similar to conditionals. The truth, I don't have $1 million. Well, that's present simple, right? Do not have. The wish, I wish I had $1 million. So we've made negative become positive, and we've backshifted 1 tense from present simple to past simple. Taking a look at another example of that, we've got the truth, I didn't go to the party. So that's past simple. And the wish, I wish I had gone to the party. So past simple has backshifted to past perfect in exactly the same way as the conditionals, as unreal conditionals. Another grammatical area that it's used in is reported speech. Well, if Craig said, direct quote, I love conditionals, and actually, sadly enough, it happens to be true, to report that speech, Craig said he loved conditionals. So what I said was in the present simple, and I've backshifted to the past simple. Let's take another example at how that works. Craig said, oh, I was walking in the park when it happened. Was walking? What tense is that? That's past continuous, right? Past continuous backshifts to past perfect continuous. So we have Craig said he had been walking in the park. You see this backshifting working in exactly the same way. Let's take a look at a third and final way that backshifting is used. It's to do with this idea of this I'd rather or I would rather and it's time. I would rather he went now. So you're talking about now. You're giving your preference or strong preference now, but you're shifting it 1 tense into the past. Or if you're talking about the past, I would rather he had gone, but he didn't go. And here we're talking about yesterday. So once again, we've backshifted 1 tense into the past. It really is an amazingly important concept, and the sooner that you can get this diagram into your mind and start dancing around the tenses, the better it'll be for your English. Let's move on and have a look at a couple of native speaker errors. So here we are with a couple of those native speaker errors. The first thing to mention is the reason I'm showing you these is in the sincere hope that you'll be able to avoid them. Okay, native speakers might make them, but that's no reason for you to make those errors as well. Here's the first of them. Native speakers will, and I think this is particularly actually a British, perhaps Australian, New Zealand error. So, my country's guilty of this one. Native speakers will often say, I would have said hello. It sounds crazy to you guys, right? Well, the reason they're making this error is because would've and would've sound exactly the same when spoken quickly. Would have, would of, would've, would've. And really, this is something you're going to have to get used to here. native speakers almost never study the grammar. Go back a couple of generations and certainly we would have studied it at school. But for the past really 40 years, English native speakers it's just never really been a subject in most schools. Some people out there have, but the vast majority haven't. And so we just don't ever get taught these things like you guys have been. Here's the second of the errors. Native speakers will sometimes place would on both sides of a conditional. I've strictly told you, that's not possible. But so the example being, I would have said hello if I would have been there. Well, we know that in that sentence, in the main clause, the I would have said hello, that's fine. But then we'll also sometimes put it in the conditional clause, if I would have been there. We'll put it there erroneously. It shouldn't be there. The reason for this error is, well, in the contracted forms, I had and I would, well, they're the same. I'd, I apostrophe D. But we've also kind of got running in our heads what seems to be correct and what sounds right after the word have. And so we've got this kind of mixed up situation where we've said would have when we mean had been there. We'll say would have been there. We're kind of vaguely aware that we need to throw it into the past, but so there's been a mix-up with I had and I would, because in the contracted forms they're the same. And once again, this is due to the fact that native speakers really, really rarely study the grammar. Let's have a look at the final of our mistakes here. Some native speakers might not backshift from past number 1 to past number 2. And apologies here, this is often a North American English issue. Sorry for any offense, any North Americans out there. The outcome is this leaves a lot of us wondering, well, is this statement real or is it unreal? What's happened here? The reason, just pure laziness, and once again, we pretty much never study the grammar of our own language. You guys do. You spend thousands of hours studying, whether it's Portuguese or Japanese. You study your own languages in school. We just don't. Not even for a single minute. And so, because of that, it's hardly surprising that we will sometimes make some of these errors and have no clue that they're errors or why we're making them. So with that all done, that just leaves me to say, hey, thank you very much for watching the second video, the second lesson in the Logical English series of lessons. There's a great exercise in the study guides right at the end about for you to practice all of the conditionals and what we've learned today. If you don't have a study guide, please head over to the website logicalenglish.com to download one. While you're there, if you can, a little donation would be great. Something along the lines of, I don't know, $1 for a lesson or something, just to help with the upkeep of the website and everything. And I'll see you for the next video, which will be all about relative clauses.